Got it. Right, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. You'll have gathered by now that Simon Baldwin of Cupar Now is hosting us. And once again, we're very, very grateful for all the help we get from him. Welcome on behalf of Cupar and District. Cupar Development Trust works across the whole area of the Bell-Baxter High School catchment. And Simon, I think, has a map which will show just how wide an area this is. And for your information, the local primary schools are now teaching the Old Scots and medieval culture in place of Romans and Egyptians. So that was the big breakthrough that followed last year's celebrations.
2 seconds, Bill, because it should be able to let me share it, but for some reason it's not letting me share it. So I don't know whether that's because I've changed hosting to Amy or not. It did this before, if I remember.
Don't worry too much about my slides. And
no, I've got it. I've got it.
You got it there?
I've got it there.
Welcome. That's what you're attending. In case you didn't know, anyone who's expecting something else, log off now. Simon, the next slide is just to show the map of the huge area which is covered by Bell-Baxter's catchment, and we have there are 17 primary schools as well as the Kilmaron Special School. And these talks are an important part of our celebrations of Sir David Lyndsay of Cupar and Scotland's first play, Ain Satire. And they're organised, these talks, by a consortium of 8 of the local organisations, which are coming up on screen now, and of course with the support of Cupar Now. And you probably know of those organisations: CDT, the Heritage Centre and Museum, Cupar Arts, Margaret Robertson is with us tonight, the Fife Family History Society, which operates out of Cupar, Fife Folk Museum in series, On Fife, the Libraries Service, the Falkland Society, which of course is a very important part of our medieval heritage in this area, and Three Estates Cupar, a schio which was set up specifically to celebrate the Lyndsay connection. This year's talks follow last year's talks. And these are the talks we had last year. They were both recorded, and they're available either through Cupar Now or on other websites. If you have any problem finding them, just let me know whenever you're searching. And this year's talks following on, today we have Amy Blakeway, next week Nicola Royan, who's just joined us, and Thursday, the 26th of May, Greg Walker. And you'll see the intellectual heft, if I can put it that way, of this year's talks: an introduction to the Scottish court and the culture, then Sir David Lyndsay and his works, but not including the famous play. And then Greg Walker will give a talk specifically on Ain Satire of the Three Estates. So I now invite Amy to give us her talk, and we'll let her screen share, and off we go.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming along to listen to me on what in Edinburgh, at least, is a really lovely sunny evening. I'm hoping that everybody can see the screen that I am sharing, and I'm now just trying to switch this along so that I can, there we go, you'll have all of this hopefully over the whole screen. Right, there we go. If I could have a thumbs up from Bill or Simon. Lovely, excellent. Okay, so thank you very much for coming to hear me, and welcome everybody. I'm talking today about the court of James V. James V, of course, someone for whom David really inseparable from David Lyndsay. The two men were extremely close, and Lyndsay was extremely important to James, just as James was important to Lyndsay. I'm going to start off a little bit by thinking about James, though, and working round to Lyndsay within this. Because if we think about Lyndsay as James's court poet, from a modern historical perspective, Lyndsay's got quite a difficult job, because James V's reputation amongst historians is frankly not very nice. To hear someone like Jenny Wormald tell it, this is the kind of man you wouldn't want to meet down a dark alley in the middle of the night. He's seen as vindictive. He's seen as somebody described as more Tudor than Stewart. We'll come back to his Tudor blood. And he's seen as somebody who is not very kind to his nobility, who rules through fear rather than love, to misquote Machiavelli, a near contemporary, of course, of James and Lyndsay. And yet, on the other hand, we've got this folk historiography that James was the poor man's king, that he dressed up as a beggar or a man of the people to go around and find out what was happening, what was really going on. Now, tonight, what I want to do is to give you a sense of why I think that actually both of these, the idea of James as the poor man's king, but even more than that, the idea of James as some kind of vindictive tyrant, are really, to put it simply, wrong. James V was the last Catholic king of a Catholic Scotland. He was caught between the medieval and the early modern worlds. And I think that means when you step away and you look at James V through the distance of history and you read sources like John Knox, George Buchanan, or James's English enemies, sources written, let us be really clear, on the other side of the Reformation rebellion, which Dr. Rhodes talked about so fluidly last year, these sources are writing, to put it simply, from a biased and Protestant perspective. What I want to do is to say, let's shift the lens tonight. Let's look at sources from the time. Let's look at the evidence produced by James V's regime itself and see what was really going on. And as we're doing so, there are two big themes I want to highlight for you guys to look out for. And both of these, I think, really speak to important concerns of your local lad made good, David Lyndsay. The first is this issue of Catholicism, Protestantism, and reform of the church. And I want to sort of show to you the way in which Catholicism in James's court was a vibrant yet adaptive religion. It's a religion that is lively, that people are buying into, but that doesn't mean they're not critical of. There's not the perspective to get better. And secondly, I really want to drive home the extent to which, although David Lyndsay was really special in being somebody who knew about performance, who could turn some natty words, who could write a good memorable phrase and organize a fantastic play, these skills were not entirely unusual because the culture of which he was a part, the political culture in which he participated, was entirely performative. In that sense, he was a man of his times. But first, I'm going to briefly introduce my boy, James V, King of Scots. I've actually got his face on a mug sitting next to me on the table. So just to sort of let you know what a James V groupie I am there. So let's give you a little bit of a background introduction. Now, James started to rule in 1528, but he actually became king in 1513, immediately after the Battle of Flodden. And he was his first regent was his mother, Margaret Tudor. Here she is. This is my favourite portrait of Margaret Tudor because she has that wee monkey with her. And I always like to use this because I think it sort of gives you a sense in which the British courts in this period were really interconnected in a much broader world. You know, we're talking about a small little rock in the middle of the North Sea, and yet the court pets are monkeys in the case of Margaret Tudor, but parrots and lions, perhaps, in the case of her son. So Margaret was immediately appointed to rule after the death of James's father, James IV. And in some ways, Margaret was a bit of a surprising choice as regent. She's English, so she's assumed to be foreign and maybe not have good interests at heart. She's relatively young, so perhaps a little bit politically inexperienced. And she's a woman, so perhaps has not been directly involved in politics. However, Margaret has one huge advantage, and this is why James IV appoints her to rule for their son in his testament. As a mother, she is supposed to have, the conventions and assumptions of the time are that she will love her son above anything else, and that as a mother, she would fight like the lioness would for her cub to protect her child. So Margaret was appointed regent. Unfortunately, when handling a nobility who had just lost their king to the hands of Margaret's younger brother, this didn't go down particularly well, and Margaret quickly found herself alienated and unable to really secure a faction, secure enough people to support her. And with her remarriage, she lost the regency. Unfortunately, in the 16th century, even if a woman was given the care of her children by her husband's testament, according to his will, she would lose that when she remarried because she'd passed into the legal curatory of her new husband. So Margaret stopped being regent, but that does not mean that her influence diminished. Certainly not, because it was from her that James V got his claim to the English throne. And this is something that's really important to sort of hang on to when we're thinking about James's reign, his position in terms of Europe, and his position in terms of religious change. This is a quick list of James V and the English succession. Now, there's going to be time for questions at the end of this talk, and I've included this here because if you guys don't have enough questions for me, I will be asking you questions on this. So take notes carefully and think, because otherwise you're going to be asked to reproduce this really quickly. Now, in all seriousness, what this shows is that James is never more than 3 heartbeats away from becoming King of England because of Henry VIII's marital shenanigans. Hold this in your mind, because this explains an awful lot about what happens when James grows up and is ruling for himself. But for now, Margaret has remarried. She'd married the Earl of Angus, and she succeeded as regent by James's close cousin, John Stewart, Duke of Albany. Now, John Stewart, Duke of Albany, is James's heir apparent. If he and his little brother, who is just alive at this point, Margaret was pregnant with him when James IV died. If both James and his little brother die, the throne will go to Albany. He's a direct descendant of King James II, and he is somebody who has a really good claim in the Stewart line of succession. However, because his father had entered political exile, he'd spent his entire life in France, and he arrives back in Scotland unable to speak Old Scots. And having heard the 2 talks last year, you're all going to know what an absolutely dreadful tragedy this is. However, I like Albany. I like his approach to governing. When he realises that he's going to go back to Scotland, the land of his forebearers, the first thing he does is acquire some histories and chronicles of Scotland, and he reads them avidly on the ship, sort of exam prepping par excellence in order to read. Of course, his arrival means that the bilingual culture of the Scots court is really brought to the fore in the record keeping. When you're reading the council register for this time, you find occasionally some fantastic rows about translation. Albany's sitting there, obviously not able to understand the business that's being transacted around him, and the secretary is doing simultaneous translation into French. And occasionally you get one of the lords saying, "Oi, I didn't say that. That wasn't a good translation. Pull back." So Albany gives us a real insight into some of the challenges of working in a bilingual political culture. He was also, as the extensive quotation on this slides from Buchanan, translated out of his Latin, shows you, someone who really took his royal duty of justice seriously. He really acted on behalf of the king as much as he could. That's not to say he was a perfect regent. Whilst he was in Scotland, he left his wife in France, and he came back with with one daughter who we know who was alive, who he'd fathered while he was in Scotland. So certainly, well, I mean, not that dissimilar to our current Prime Minister, perhaps, but not necessarily the height of moral probity, and certainly something that, if he'd had a court poet, would have been the subject of stinging critique, I'm sure. But Albany's French position pulled him between Scotland and France. And that created big problems for the Scots, and it created big problems for Albany personally. Sometimes he was called back to France to serve in the French life that he had. So although those nearly 10 years of regency brought good justice and brought a degree of stability, it also brought a degree of febrility for the Scots. And when Albany was away, there was always this opportunity for James's uncle, Henry VIII, to try and muscle in. And it was on one of these visits in 1524, when Albany failed to come back on time, that the Scots decided enough was enough. Queen Margaret declared that her son, James, was now an adult. He was about 12, 13 at this point. So I mean, adult in the very loosest sense of the word. And the plan was he'd rule on his own. Unfortunately for James, however, the man who cost Margaret the regency, the Earl of Angus, who was specifically not a regent because James had been declared an adult, in a dramatic coup kidnapped the king and held him effectively as a prisoner for 4 years while Angus ran an Anglophile pro-English regime in Scotland. And it was not until 1528 when James V escaped and managed to really begin to rule in his own right. Now, throughout all of this, as you can see, James was a monarch who experienced a lot of flux in his childhood, in terms of the people around him, in terms of the people in charge, in terms of the guidance, the advice, the role models he will have received. And this is where Lyndsay comes in as a really crucial point of contact. As one of the ushers of James's court, Lyndsay was there throughout. Some historians think it was even Lyndsay who held James at his coronation. There's no actual evidence surrounding this, but it's a reasonable supposition. So when we're thinking about why Lyndsay can be so forthright with James, so fierce with James, so clear with James, and so publicly, it's this close connection, this point of consistency, this having known him through childhood, which is absolutely key to that. Okay, so 1528 comes. James has escaped from Angus. Angus, tail between his legs, has fled south of the border to see Henry VIII, and he enters exile in England, where he remains until James died. Does this mean that everything was rosy for James? Empty in tray? He could just relax and wait for the next import of French wine and a bit of song and perhaps the next play to be produced? Sadly, not. James had a big problem. His uncle, Henry VIII. Now, I've chosen this picture because in some popular depictions of Henry VIII, culturally at the moment, there's this attempt to depict him as kind of a young, handsome man who could joust and there's almost this attempt amongst English historians to kind of get away from the early 20th century popular Henry, of him being kind of fat, gout-ridden and dreadful. From my perspective, as a historian of the reign of James V, it's the fat, gout-ridden Henry that I want you to think about. Look at those mean, piggy eyes. This is not a man with generosity in his heart. This is a man with a severe sense of acquisitiveness, and that extended to the neighbouring country to the north. From Henry VIII's perspective, the reign of his nephew, a very close blood relative, who was considerably younger than him, provides an opportunity. Henry VIII, like all English monarchs before him, grew up in an environment saturated by the concept of English suzerainty, the idea of English overlordship of the Scots, effectively. So Henry has that running through his DNA as the man who wore the crown of England. But as his reign developed, something new came into this cocktail. And this is the insecurity brought about by Henry's religious schism. His desire to have an heir, his desire to break away, therefore, from the Catholic Church, which would not allow him a divorce, meant that Henry was isolated. He was a European pariah. And Scotland, therefore, represented a vulnerability in his defences, which it had really not done for any previous English monarch. Concomitantly, of course, this increased James V's market value to his fellow Catholic monarchs quite considerably. But it presented him with a problem because Henry VIII was constantly pushing, trying to encourage James to convert, trying to encourage James to leave Catholicism and align instead with him. Okay, I've just claimed all of that. It's marking season. If this was an essay and I was marking it, by this point, I would put a big question mark in the margin and put evidence, question mark, exclamation mark. So let's have a bit of evidence. So this is from a set of Henry's instructions to his ambassadors in October 1535. What did he say? He told James that the ambassadors were supposed to go to James and tell him to open your eyes to the threat posed by Catholicism and the incursions of the Pope. Moreover, were to explain to him, Catholic monarchs are like children in their nonage. So it's this idea that if you're a Catholic and you are loyal to the Pope, you are somehow not a proper monarch. You're somebody who is effectively going to be unable to rule effectively. You're going to have your ability to be a proper monarch curtailed. And this is Henry's constant refrain towards James. If you're a Catholic, you're somehow neutered as a monarch. And we see this again in another embassy, a famous set of instructions. I'm going to just leave these up here for you to read while I talk around them. Incidentally, Ralph Sadler, has anyone seen Wolf Hall? Because a few years ago, everyone would have been saying, yes, yes, absolutely right. So this is the same Ralph Sadler from Wolf Hall. This is Sadler developing his diplomatic career. So Sadler is sent north and he sort of gets his reputation as an expert on Scotland, but as my students always say, he's not really that good an expert given everything he does goes wrong, but for some reason he's considered to be an expert on Scotland. And he's told to tell James that Henry VIII has heard bruit rumours that James has got in his hands numbers of sheep. So James is apparently gathering up sheep. This is true. James was farming sheep in order to get wool to raise and increase royal income. And Henry said that this is too mean a thing for a king to be doing. This is not, in other words, this is not a kingly enough thing. Kings shouldn't be concerned with sheep farming. Kings ought to do other things. And what's Henry's suggestion? Why don't you dissolve the monasteries just like I've done? That's a really good way to make sure that you're going to make money. James's response, well, I have no sheep. I don't know what's going on. There might be sheep on my lands, but I don't know about them. And then here's the kicker. There is a good old man, my good father, the King of France. I must needs call him that. I'm sure he's like a father to me that will not see me want anything that lies in him to help me with. My good father, the King of France. Now, that's a reference to the fact that for the King of France, Francis I, is James's father-in-law. They are indeed connected by marriage. And so in this quotation from Sir Ralph Sadler's report, we're really seeing the tensions between James and his uncle emerging. James is being pushed by Henry to break with Rome. He's having his ability to rule, his ability to be an effective monarch questioned, and Henry is presenting as an apparent solution to these problems, the idea of James giving up Catholicism and converting to Protestantism. But James's counter, I have my European friends to help me, particularly the King of France, my father-in-law. Okay, we've spoken a little bit about the problems that James's Catholicism caused him and the tense and febrile environment that it has. Let's now start to think about some of the advantages. Here we've got first little excerpt from David Lyndsay. I had to include this. Nicola, I know you're listening. I'm sorry if you were planning on this next week, but I'm sure you will have more to say about it as well. This is a short excerpt from the poem composed by Lyndsay to celebrate Madeline and James's marriage. It's a celebration of the marriage, but it's also a mourning of her death. She died very quickly after she arrived back in Scotland. But what I take from this poem is the performativity and the vibrancy of the political culture which James witnessed in France. Lyndsay, who is with him, recalls Paris, the principal city, which receives our prince with laud and glory, solemnly through arcs triumphal. Arcs triumphal is the reference to Roman culture, the triumphal arch of victory. This is the age of humanism, of Erasmus. We've got all of our classics and references to it running through. He's like Pompey after his victory being received into Rome. And just to sort of emphasize how significant James's arrival in Paris was, he was told by his new father-in-law, Francis I, that he was being treated as an equal, as a king. He was walking before Francis's own heir, and the population of Paris were told to treat James as they would their own king. This is an incredible honor, and it really shows his enhanced European status. And of course, Lyndsay draws this back to remembering the ancient alliance between Scotland and France. So this isn't new just because James is working in a post-Reformation world, but it's really, I suppose, it's been taken up a level. It's the old alliance on steroids post the English schism. Now, this was a poem to both celebrate the old alliance and celebrate the marriage that was, and to mourn Madeline's death. And this takes me onto James's second wife, Mary of Guise, daughter of the powerful Duke of Guise, who was one of the Princes étrangers, the stranger princes, so sort of members of the French nobility, but only recently incorporated into the French court, and their duchy is really almost sort of a semi-sovereign, separate place. Now, we've just seen the description of the festivities that James experienced in Paris when he was married, and these have clearly been taken on board by those with him. Unlike Madeline, James didn't go to France to get Mary of Guise. She was just sort of popped on a ship. Well, 7 ships. That sounded a little bit like she was left at Waverley Station, kind of bye love, send us a postcard. She's sent as part of a large train, but James doesn't go himself. And then she arrives and, sensible lass, she lands in Fife. What does she encounter? Now, this is an excerpt, this description of what Mary of Guise encounters when she arrives in Scotland is a really good source for this. It's from Robert Lyndsay of Pitscotty. So again, a local source, a Fife source, really speaking to the way in which in the 16th century, Fife was an intellectual community. David Lyndsay of the Mount, again, exceptional, but not totally unusual, exceptional in terms of talent rather than the fact he existed. And Robert Lyndsay of Pitscotty is probably, maybe, I mean, date-wise, we think he probably didn't see it himself, but he's probably heard it from somebody else. This is something that he's got from a witness. And he reveals to us that Sir David Lyndsay organised a great cloud to come down from the heavens above the gate as the Queen came in, and this opens in two halves. It opens up into two parts, and then a woman comes out dressed as an angel, offering the keys of Scotland to the Queen to show that the hearts of Scotland are opened to Mary of Guise. This must have been incredibly impressive. And this is only the start of this sort of celebratory pageant around St. Andrews, where Marie is taken, she's shown the university, she's shown the cathedral, she's shown the relics of St. Andrew himself. And there are verses, plays, little performances for her at every single stage. So this is really Scotland selling itself to its new queen as a politically sophisticated place. Sorry, sorry, could you unmute yourself, please, whoever that was? It's a little distracting. Thank you. So as soon as this seems to work. So as soon as the Queen's visited the kirks and the colleges, so these are the churches, including the cathedral and the university, she went to the palace, so probably a temporary construction built for James to entertain his new wife, and she met the king, and she said she'd never seen in France or anywhere else as many good faces, as many good people as she saw that day in Scotland. So this selling of Scotland to Mary of Guise that Lyndsay has organised, absolutely 100% works. From all of this, I hope you're getting a sense that James is running, with Lyndsay's help, a really sophisticated operation. This is, in a way, total politics. This is politics as an experience, which you walk into and you are overwhelmed by, you're entirely surrounded by. Now, you could object, these are special occasions, right? The king doesn't get married that many times, he gets married twice. And he doesn't welcome his new wife to Scotland that many. Of course, they're going to throw out all the stops. This is not necessarily a culture that is hyper-politicised and hyper-performative. But I think when we look at English ambassadorial reports, we can see, in fact, exactly that. Back to Ralph Sadler. This is an excerpt from exactly the same report that we were looking at a little while ago. And here he's describing his arrival at the Scottish court. He's met by, of course, Sir David Lyndsay as the chief herald, head of the diplomatic corps, but he's accompanied by heralds and other administrators. So they meet Sadler as the English ambassador, and they bring him into the chapel where the king is at mass. And the chapel's full of the ecclesiastics, the prelates, and gentlemen, bishops, monks, priests. It's full of Scottish high political society. The king is kneeling, and he's kneeling easily underneath the cloth of estate. So that's one of these sort of cloths that you see even today at the top of the throne. That's called a cloth of estate, and it's to signify the person underneath is a monarch and is extremely special. And when Sadler enters, a place is made for him through this press and through this throng of people, and he's allowed to sit directly behind the king, kneeling at mass. Now let's just think this through here. Sadler arrives with a diplomatic mission in which he is going to try and persuade James V to give up Catholicism and convert to Protestantism, in which he is going to try and persuade James V that he should not trust his advisors from the church. And how is he met? He is met by being told, if you want to see the king, laddie, come on into the chapel. And he is forced to sit through a full Catholic mass, at which he witnesses an incredible display of unity from the king, his prelates, and his secular lords. These guys knew what they were doing. And just in case Sadler had missed the message, he did exactly the same thing. The next day, which is a Friday, so Lyndsay et al. Came to him again and said the king had sent for them to accompany them to him. And so he goes with them to the court. They bring him again to the chapel, where the Queen, the king's wife, he's specifying that because Margaret Tudor is still alive, was hearing a sermon in French, accompanied with a lot of ladies and gentlewomen. And what's really interesting is that throughout this report, Sadler only actually encounters Marie de Guise in the grounds of the chapel. I don't want to overinterpret this, but it almost seems as if James is kind of tacitly saying to Sadler, I'm keeping my queen safe from your heresy. You can only see her in the chapel. You can only see her at worship. Even if that is going too far, however, again, we are seeing through the use of repetition of this staged performance, James forcing Sadler to engage with the fact that Scotland is Catholic, and indeed forcing him as a converted Protestant to engage with the Catholic liturgy and to behave himself during a Catholic sermon. This is an absolute political coup. This is extremely successful. What this excerpt also reveals, though, and what I really what I really think it's valuable for, on top of this, or part of the reason why it's so rich, is the extent to which this reveals the buy-in that James's regime enjoys. The king is accompanied, the queen is accompanied, we get lists of people. We also see the way in which this is a smooth and organised regime. Someone has planned this out, someone has sent the herald off at the same time and coordinated that. So we're seeing a lot of behind the scenes work. Thinking back to that idea that I started with, this idea that James is some kind of vindictive tyrant who is unable to communicate effectively politically, that's not what we're seeing here. We're seeing a supported king who is able to use cohesion amongst the political community in a weaponized manner. Okay, let's go back to that idea of performativity. Now, you could quite reasonably say to me, yes, Amy, this is all very performative, and this all does really show the King's majesty, and yes, it shows us Catholicism, but this is a small audience, right? You've got an English ambassador and a few different individuals who were around the King anyway. This is quite an elite audience. Is this really getting out to the people? And my answer to you is, yeah, okay, on that evidence, fair enough, but there is evidence of a wider audience. Here, I'm going to turn to the printing of James V of Parliament. Now, this might seem like quite a niche topic, and yes, it is, but I hope I can convince you in a couple of minutes that actually it's really worthwhile. This is the first time that the laws were printed in Scotland. Now, printing is a relatively new technology, and its impact on Scots is something that is a huge topic of scholarly debate. What it does mean, though, is that a potentially wider audience is reached. Now, I don't want to overstate this, because before printing, the Acts of Parliament proclaimed that the Mercat crosses up and down the land. They will have been proclaimed in Cupar, and the same letters will have been sent onwards to St Andrews and to all the other boroughs in Fife. And all those boroughs will have been given manuscript copies, handwritten copies of those acts. So the idea that Parliament is followed by a little performance in each borough stating the laws is not new. That's well established. But this is enhancing that tradition. This is taking it up a level. This is making sure that the Acts of Parliament, as they are circulated, are going to be exactly as the King wants them. There's no risk of a slip of the pen. It also means that James has a new opportunity to present himself visually. If reading out the Acts allows him to present himself orally, and a manuscript gives you the text, this printed book provides an opportunity for a bit of branding for the Stuart monarchy. And I think we can really see this. The royal arms on the cover of this, probably many scholars have argued, and I wouldn't disagree, probably designed by Sir David Lyndsay, but at least with his help, really suggest Stuart majesty. We've got the royal motto, we've got the Lord Lion, we've got the King's heraldic achievements, and we've got what one of my fourth years once perceptively described as thistly bling going on all around. This is really sort of showing all of the different arms and different facets of Stuart monarchy. Incidentally, also around the shield, we have this collar with St Andrew hanging off it, and there's a debate about whether James V was hoping to found his own chivalric order. Potentially, this collar around the shield with St Andrew hanging off it is evidence of that. And of course, the crown that the Lord Lion is sitting on is a closed crown, an imperial crown. And the symbolism here is very simple. An open crown suggests that you are a subject king, a king who will have a superior. A closed crown suggests that you have no superior except God. You are a king who is like an emperor. So this is a very, very clear message. So that's what you open the book with, royal authority. Turning to the other side of the screen, you see the final image of the book, the closing woodcut. This is an adaptation of a German woodcut that was widely circulated in Germany and through in the Low Countries, and it's called the Great Rosary. You will instantly see, we see Christ crucified there, we have the image of the Virgin, we have the Last Judgment at the bottom, we have the doctors of the church, we have the female martyrs. This is, in short, a highly Catholic image. This is James endorsing many of the precepts of the Catholic faith. And I would just draw your attention up at the top to the image of St. Francis receiving his stigmata. Many Protestants, many reformers in this period were highly critical of the Franciscan order. And I think that by having this image of Francis on here, James's regime is actually giving a message, a nod of support to St. Francis and the friars who bore his name. So what we're seeing here is a very public awareness of what the monarchy has as its messages and a clear ability to project those outwards. Turning to the text, however, and having just emphasised how Catholic this is, I said at the very beginning, this is not necessarily accepting Catholicism as a static religion. One of the acts published here alongside acts for veneration of the saints to ensure that Mary was prayed to and processions were held in her honour. Alongside this is a statement of James, an act of James to his clergy, telling them to raise their moral standards, to reform themselves. So we're seeing here how Lyndsay might sit in a world where it's possible to critique the Catholic Church whilst remaining firmly within that faith. These acts of Parliament also speak to that other big issue I raised at the beginning, the idea that James is vindictive. Now, this in large part comes from the idea that James was very quick to punish his nobility. And James did indeed ensure that traitors were suitably punished. But when we think about Parliament's role in this, and it's important to remember that in this period, Parliament is still an active court, right? It's still a court that is hearing cases. We actually see James attempting to reconcile. Of the, I think, 7 treason cases brought before Parliament in James's personal rule, only 2 actually resulted in a conviction. In all of the rest of them, the accused was encouraged to come in, to negotiate with the king, to publicly apologise, and to be received back into the community of the realm. So what we're seeing here is a man who has very clear lines, and when they're crossed, he will push for the highest penalty. But if you come just shy of them, he's willing to try and work with you. It's about political cohesion. It's the same idea that a strong country is a cohesive country that we saw when in that description of James and his whole nobility at Mass. So the Acts of Parliament and publishing them are one way in which James is getting these messages about his regime out to a wider audience. But he also got on his horse and rode, and on one famous occasion, he got on his ship and sailed. And the last thing I want to tell you about before we conclude is James's 1540 voyage to the Isles. Now, sadly, this is not an image from the period. This is a book published in France in the 1580s. I took photographs this afternoon for you in the National Library of Scotland. Extremely rare, so we're very lucky to have this. And it contains the first map really produced of the Scottish coastline in this much detail, and certainly the first printed map is extraordinary. Now, the fact this is published 40 years after the voyage happens shows how important it was. And this map was incredibly high quality. And we'll start with that. Why would James be producing a map like this? Now, this is something that's a little bit kind of keeping up with the Valois, keeping up with the Tudors, the other European monarchs of the time, who were also really into maps. It's something that people are doing, but it's also a way of asserting your authority. Remember that the Isles have only relatively recently come into the possession of the Stuart monarchy as part of the dowry of James III's Queen Margaret of Denmark, and there's some contest still about their ownership. Taking this sea voyage not only allows James to assert his personal authority on the Isles by going there, showing them to his nobility, interacting with the people, but taking the map actually delineates very carefully the lines and the boundaries of James's empire. Remember that closed crown. It also seems like a fantastic opportunity for James to show off. He has a huge number of new clothes made, all in the Stewart livery colours of red and gold. He has a gold whistle fashioned for himself to give the idea that he's an admiral in charge of the voyage, although, of course, actually the people running the show are experienced sea captains. He has entertaining spaces built on the ships that he is inhabiting, and these include cloths of estate. These include many moving council chambers to show you the king who's taking advice and governing even when he's on the move. This isn't just a jolly. And in fact, even the ships are an expression of power. One of the fleet is the Mary Willoughby, a vessel captured by one of James's sea captains from the English during the War of 1532-3. And the other was a gift from his father-in-law Francis, one of the ships that one of the gifts that James received as part of his marriage settlement. So even if people asked, where did these ships come from, that positioning that Scotland has between England and France will have been foregrounded and will have been clear. And this voyage in 1540 occurs at exactly the same time as the project to print the Acts of Parliament. And I actually always feel quite sorry for the folk who were forced to stay at home, work on printing the Acts of Parliament, while everybody else got to go on sort of the ultimate corporate away day to the Isles on these ships with these golden whistles and the beautiful food, which we also know they prepared. Seeing this, seeing a monarch at the height of his power, gives us a rather different perspective of James to the ones passed down to us by those Protestant post-Reformation chroniclers. And in fact, for me, it also makes it hard to ask a question that is very difficult for a historian to resist. What if? What if James had not died shortly after this voyage in December 1542? What if he had carried on living? But that would be certainly another talk. Okay, and this is just the Fife coast from that map. And I just note, you can really see the extent to which this is a sea captain's map. There's nothing inland. Look at the detail with which they're giving you the information you need to sail and to move around safely. Anything inland, no interest whatsoever. This is a really kind of focused purpose on this map. And sadly, that does mean they miss out Cupar. I nearly didn't include this, but I thought it still made the point really nicely, and I hope you forgive me. Okay. But how can I tie this talk together? I hope that I've shown you that James V, ably aided by his Lord Lion, but also a large number of folk around him, presided over a lively, performative, and sophisticated political culture. This was a culture that knew what it did well, but embraced new technology, such as the printing press, in order to disseminate the messages it wanted to. These were that James was the king of a strong, independent nation, that he was a monarch who was a key part of a line of monarchs who had a long and unbroken line of kings who in themselves helped to prove Scotland's independence from England, and his Catholicism, his loyalty to the Pope, not blind, but strong loyalty, was an essential part of this. In fact, a court which prizes performance, which embraces new technology, which balances loyalty with critical advice and an ability to speak truth. Well, that sounds like just the kind of place you'd find one Sir David Lyndsay of the Mount to me. Thank you very much indeed. I hope you've enjoyed the talk. I think we've got a few minutes for questions, and that is James's unicorn from Holyrood Palace, in case you're wondering what that was. So thank you.
That was a tour de force. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you in particular for the way you've managed to focus the local interest on this. I mean, Lyndsay was obviously a very interesting person. What you've left in my mind is, with all this Catholicism all around us, he was a very brave playwright. And the play that Greg's going to talk us through in 2 weeks' time, slanging off the Catholic Church, is obviously a fairly brave step. Thank you also for pointing out that there's another Lyndsay locally, the cousin Robert of Pitscotty. Both were educated, we think, at Cooper's Grammar School, and you were very complimentary about Cooper Fife. We take those compliments graciously and gratefully. I have a couple of questions myself, but I'd like to throw this open to the audience first. Anyone either put up a hand or wave or whatever you'd like to do? I think you may have stunned them. You're probably all worried that you are going to test. John.
I was just a couple of things there I was wondering about. I mean, this is a kind of a nice view of James V. And I can remember hearing years ago, now out of date, about he was quite grasping. He managed to acquire money in various ways through his dowries and taxing the church. And also he pursued the Douglas family. And I just wonder what the view now is of these things. Is he still seen as grasping? And is he still seen as pursuing the Douglases ruthlessly? How's that interpreted in light of the new interpretation of James?
So I think I'll take those two things separately, John. The first question is about money. Any Renaissance monarch needs more money all the time. James is certainly somebody who is very keen to ensure that the crown is on a stable financial footing, and the enterprises that he engaged in are obviously in part designed to raise cash. So that is definitely an important, that is definitely true. The question is then, how would people have reacted to this? Now, whenever James requests a tax, it's for something that's a legitimate purpose. He only requests taxes when he's going to go to war with England or when he's looking for an embassy to get a wife. And in this period, taxation is not something that's constant. The king has to come up with a reason, go to Parliament or a convention and request a tax. And James, as far as we know, never refused a tax. The only evidence we've got for refusal comes in English spy reports. Now that suggests that doesn't mean people don't try and negotiate down and say, well, would you take some horses rather than some money, and so on and so forth. But this does not bespeak a realm that is thinking, oh my goodness, this king is so unreasonable, this king is really grasping. James has a healthy interest in money, but it does not seem to be the case that his nobility or his clergy are more discontented than they were with any other monarch. And I think sort of there's also an argument that if you look at the pattern of Stuart monarchs, and James died extremely young, right? He was only just sort of in his 30s. If you look at patterns of Stuart monarchs, actually the big patronage tends to come later in their rule when they're really established. So if you get someone like James IV, he sort of spends a bit of time kind of getting the crown up to where it needs to be financially, then he can afford to do patronage. And James is generous. He does give out patronage as well. That's the answer to the first part. Pursuing the Douglases. James is extremely angry with the Douglases, but let's be quite clear what the Douglases have done. The Douglases have kidnapped the king. They have prevented him accessing his councillors. They have laid hands on the king, and they have kidnapped him and kept him in prison. They have then gone south and given intelligence about Scotland's defences to the King of England. This, I mean, I know Bill practiced as a lawyer for many years. I'm not sure whether the laws of treason has changed, but if you were a member of the Court of Session in the 1530s, case closed, that is treason. So the Douglases are traitors, and they are pursued according to the laws that appertain to traitors. There's then the question of the Douglas sisters. One of them, Lady Glamis, is indeed pursued again for treason and meets the death penalty. The consensus now, therefore, is that whilst James's regime moves extremely harshly against people who are traitors, this idea that anyone tainted by a Douglas connection, if you once had a cup of ale with Lady Glamis when you were both in your late teens, you're going to somehow be caught by the king and done. It's that older idea of James, that's now completely gone. James will push for the highest penalties, but the point is those punishments are exemplary, and actually the example seems to work. They don't do it again. People tend not to do this again. So again, it's a partial reading of the evidence. It's a skewed reading of the evidence. And what I'd also note about the Douglases is that if we're thinking about older histories, the Douglases are Protestants, the Douglases are Anglophiles. So if you were writing history from the perspective of late 16th century Scotland, where we're realigning towards England diplomatically, we've realigned completely religiously, the Douglases are the way. And James represents this much older view of Scotland, this alternative view of Scotland. So I think that does affect it as well. So I hope that answers the question.
It does. That's excellent. Thanks.
Thank you, Amy. Have we any other questions? I'm conscious that Amy has to be on her way in 4 minutes, but I'm sure there's time for one more question if somebody wants to ask one.
Bill, sorry. Bill,
yes.
sorry. I just wanted not a question, but I can't help but keep going back to the thistly bling.
Yeah. I think we see another example of the artistic style here, do we not?
I rather like that. I'm sure somebody must use that as the name for a band at some point. It was rather good. Thistly bling, but yes, no, excellent. It was great. It was a great talk. Thank you very much.
You could see the chuckles when you reported on that, Amy. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, that was one of the moments where I really felt my students were absolutely onto something, and they totally got what was going on. So it was a nice moment as a teacher.
I'm sure, and I'm sure they have learned a huge amount at your feet, Amy, because you've certainly done that for us tonight. It's been a superb presentation, and thank you again so much for making it absolutely pertinent to what Cupar and District is researching and trying to build up on in our heritage and our history, and how we can make use of it in various ways. I've mentioned the primary schools and the education, and of course the more mercenary approach to making Cupar a better place for people to visit. Just as an aside, last September we had Cupar's celebration weekend, and at the cross we were graced by the current Lord Lion and by the current Lairds of the Mount. So that was a deliberate bit of history standing at the cross, which seemed to go down quite well and was well understood, obviously, by those who were present. Amy, thank you so much. I could bash on. People who know me know I often do, but I shall resist that tonight. Thank you so much. It's been a splendid event, and we're very grateful.
Well, thank you very much. Lovely to meet everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.